How justified were the suitors? Did Odysseus visit the underworld? What theme do I think is overlooked? And much more. I've picked out some elements in the Odyssey to talk about on the Ancient History Hound podcast. Hi, welcome. My name's Neil, and in this episode, I thought I'd pick out some elements, themes, call them what you will, from the Odyssey and discuss them. I'm hopping between topics with the occasional strange segue, but hope you will find this Homeric buffet interesting. This then is a collection of musings about the poem and not, I repeat, not about the recent film. If you wanted to listen to me talk about a film based on the Odyssey, check out the Ancient History Hound episode, The Return with Lottie Luke, where I discuss the film The Return, which I always recommend as a really interesting watch. You can find me on social media as Ancient Blogger on Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky, and the like. There's also the Ancient Blogger YouTube channel, which I've been doing quite a bit for, and the Ancient History Hound subreddit, which is always good fun. If you want something a bit more old school, you can email me, ancientblogger@hotmail.com. Okay then, let's get to it. I want to start with a few bits about the poem, the first of which is sometimes forgotten. The Odyssey was and is a poem. Though we engage with it in numerous ways, perhaps most commonly in book form, the way someone in ancient Greece would have likely experienced it would have been in the audience watching someone perform a section of it. The professionals who did these, rhapsodies, would sing and perhaps be accompanied by instruments. It would be a real performance, not just a dry reading. That they performed parts of the poem was because to perform it from beginning to end would take, well, it's been debated, but sometimes between 12 to 14 or even 16 hours, given the various estimates and exactly how you might go about this. The second bit I want to talk about is about dates. When exactly the Odyssey was composed is debated, but it's largely agreed that this occurred sometime between the late 8th and late 7th centuries BC. Its composition is therefore several centuries after the mythical date of the Trojan War, which again has been speculated at around 1200 BC, again with the big caveat of a mythical date. And this places the events of the Trojan War and the Odyssey in the Bronze Age. The poem attempts to recreate, therefore, an earlier world, and as a result there are some anachronisms which are to be expected and are in no way a criticism of the poem. These include common references to iron, or rather iron being used more commonly than it might have been thought to have done, and also really niche stuff. So, for example, how ships were built, and even architectural layouts. However, there are also older elements preserved within the poem, and they feel as if they belong to the era that the poem was set in. One, in fact, is a very interesting ritual, which I'll be speaking about later. I want to start, though, with Penelope and an interaction she has in Book 4. After discovering that her son has sailed off to Pylos and that the suitors plan on ambushing him on his return, a distressed Penelope eventually falls asleep in her room. She has a dream in which an image of her sister, Iptheme, appears to her, but this is all at the contrivance of Athena, who wants to offer support to the increasingly isolated queen. The word used to describe the image of her sister is eidolon, and this is sometimes translated as a phantom or illusion. It's obviously not the real person, but instead represents them. One eidolon which Odysseus sees when speaking with the dead is that of Heracles. Though Heracles died in the mortal sense, he was also taken up to Olympus, and this eidolon of Heracles instead acts as some sort of placeholder in the underworld. The eidolon of Iptheme is quite an interesting thing. It physically manifests as it is described as entering the room Penelope is sleeping in through the keyhole and stands above her head. Yet Penelope interacts with it in her dream. This interaction tells us a great deal about Penelope, and in particular, how even when dreaming, she is nobody's fool. As mentioned, the image has been sent by Athena, with the idea being that as it has taken the form of her sister, it will presumably not scare her. And it certainly doesn't do that. And Penelope immediately starts quizzing it, initially asking how her sister has arrived, and adding that she's, never bothered before. When the Eidolon states that she didn't worry as her husband is safe, it causes Penelope to press even harder, which results in the Eidolon to, pun intended, give up the ghost and float away. The intention of Athena was to offer Penelope some support, and when she awakes the queen does feel relief. She feels reassured by this. However, this short scene feels almost as if it's parodying the type of event we see elsewhere in the poem, when someone, often a deity, impersonates a person and gives advice or prompts some action. It might be me, but when I read this, I thought of the young child sat on Santa's lap in the grotto at Christmas who calls his bluff, and simply won't have it that this is the real Santa. It's a sort of recognition scene gone wrong, albeit in an amusing fashion. It also shows us that Penelope is very switched on. And in a more serious way, this sort of preempts the later recognition scene where she continually tests Odysseus. A more famous instance of an Eidolon involved at Troy was that of Helen. In the 6th century BC, the poet Stesichorus wrote that Helen never went there, and instead an Eidolon was sent to replace her. This offence to Helen allegedly caused the poet to go blind, at which point he wrote another poem apologising for the insult, and his sight returned. The subject of Helen not being at Troy was something the historian Herodotus investigated. He spoke with the priests in Egypt who checked their records, and yes, Helen was detained in Egypt when she and Paris arrived there on their way to Troy. Paris was allowed to carry on, but Helen was made to wait until Menelaus arrived to collect her. In fact, Herodotus blamed the whole Trojan War on a singular misunderstanding. When the Greeks were told Helen wasn't at Troy, they thought they were being insulted by the Trojans and not being told the truth, and therefore started their siege. Herodotus concluded that there's no way Priam, a wise and deferential individual, would have condoned the actions of Paris and let her stay there. If nothing, this is an interesting window into how ancient Greeks viewed their own mythologies. There was obviously some discussions being had as to what you might believe and what you didn't. Before I go any further, here is a promo from Alexandria, a Hellenistic World podcast. As you might know, I don't do adverts. Not that I have the option, but even if I was offered, I'd turn them down because this is a hobby and, well, you know, adverts. What I've always tried to do for coming up to 9 years now has been sharing the love of other ancient history content, and this podcast is certainly well worth a listen.
Hi all. If you enjoy this podcast, you might also enjoy Alexandria, a Hellenistic world. The Hellenistic period is famous for its epic battles and backstabbing royal families. But for every king or general, there were thousands of other stories. Bureaucrats like Zenon the estate manager, or soldiers like Pyrrhikos, a cavalry officer who terrorized the very village he was tasked to protect. Or just regular people you never hear about anywhere else, but you should. Like Tesicles, an old mother wronged by her daughter who moved to the big city, or Eliphion, a prostitute who fell in love with one of her clients. These were real people. These are their stories. Join me as we travel to Alexandria, a Hellenistic world.
I started listening to the first episode and I was immediately struck by the great storytelling, so keep up the great work and I hope you enjoy that recommendation. Returning to the Odyssey, but keeping within the theme of women, there is a discussion to be had as to how they're represented. It's easy to consider them as passive and ineffective, at least the mortal ones. However, look closer and you can find more emboldened and nuanced depictions where women do have power and control. Indeed, a good example of this is Arete, the queen of the Phaeacians. When Odysseus is told by Nausicaa to go to the palace and meet the king and queen there, he is met by Athena, who is in disguise. She advises that Odysseus needs to meet the queen first, and describes her as being universally loved, very intelligent, and someone who settles disputes. In short, Odysseus needs to get onto her right side as soon as he can. And he takes this advice and grabs her knee in an act of supplication as soon as he gets the chance to. Arete is therefore framed as the person in charge. She makes decisions about the society through arbitration, and that Odysseus moves to her first to make this appeal underlines her importance. You might argue that she, not so much the king, is in charge. At the very least, you can argue that she is not relegated to anything close to a passive role. There is also a comment on her character, and something that she shares with Penelope, in that she's very astute. When Odysseus first arrives at the court, she recognises the clothes he wears as those being she wove herself. She immediately picks up on this and asks him how he came to wear them and how he arrived here. Odysseus is, wait for it, honest. Throughout the poem, when Odysseus is asked to provide a backstory, he usually goes all in to provide a fictional one with a lot of detail, and in fairness to him, sometimes it's a good idea. However, here, there's no improv, just pure honesty. This contrasts with how Odysseus talks to the king. When he first addresses King Alcinous, he says to him that all he wants to do is get home so he can live out the rest of his days at home. But this isn't the truth. When he later recounts his encounter with Tiresias when speaking with the dead, he includes the instruction that the blind prophet has for him, namely to travel home and then travel on. Tiresias tells him that he will end his days a long way from Ithaca. I suppose you could say it makes sense for Odysseus to try and really appeal to the king, saying how much he wants to get home and stay there. However, his interaction with the queen suggests that he has utmost respect for her. The next area I want to discuss is also ensconced in what we might term female power, though it includes a theme I think flies under the radar. Aside from the Cyclops, the challenge of the Sirens is one of the most famous in the poem, and I did a video on my YouTube channel about a famous depiction of it on a vase. It's Circe who tells Odysseus about them, and how to avoid them through using wax in your ears, so you don't hear their singing. When Circe provides this advice, she states that Odysseus has the option of using wax or being tied to the mast. However, when Odysseus talks to his crew, he tells them that Circe told him he needed to be tied to the mast. One way of understanding this is that Odysseus is, well, Odysseus, and he's there to endure challenges and rise to them. And this might explain why he also ignores her advice as to how to deal with Scylla. That is to say, he arms himself and delays the ship, rather than just sail past it, as she suggested, without arming himself, and this results in men losing their lives, a point I will return to later. The nature of the challenge with the Sirens is that of being lured by their song, which makes you forget about home and causes inaction. The Sirens don't eat their victims, instead they waste away as they sit enthralled by the singing. Singing and songs often provide a potent challenge to Odysseus and others in the poem, and in a way it makes sense. After all, this is a poem and it would have been sung, so perhaps the poet was making a wider comment on the power and the effectiveness of singing and, well, oral poetry. Consider the reaction Odysseus has at the court of the Phaeacians. Here a bard called Demodocus sings of Troy, and this causes Odysseus to sob uncontrollably. He's only saved when the king notices this and asks the bard to stop. The song invokes emotions which need to be kept in check, and this is every bit as much as a challenge as any large monster in a cave. It's not just the singing of a bard or siren which can harbour dangers. Telemachus faces a similar situation when he travels to the court of Menelaus. Here the king speaks about Odysseus in a way which causes Telemachus to weep, with others also brought close to tears. Emotions are running high, and it's Helen who saves the day by mixing in a drug with their wine which calms things down. This, I should add, is noted in the poem as something she learned in Egypt, and I should also add that Egypt is mentioned by Menelaus in his tale of how he returned from Troy, but this has been cited as part of that wider discussion concerning Helen and Egypt which I made earlier. There's also a possible parallel with this situation and that of Odysseus and the Sirens. In both cases, words or song elicit a reaction which needs to be checked. Emotions are running wild. It's also women who offer the solution. Circe with her advice about using wax or being tied to the mast, and Helen with the drugs in the wine. Circe's dialogue with Odysseus included a plan of action to return home, as well as offering nuanced advice, and this brings me to one of the parts of the poem I've always found fascinating. That is when Odysseus talks with the dead. Often this event is painted as Odysseus descending into the underworld, a process known as Katabasis in ancient Greece. I go into this in more detail in an episode of the Ancient History Helm podcast titled The Greek Underworld. It's one of my annual Night of the Living Dead Halloween specials. However, in many ways what Odysseus undertakes isn't a visit to the underworld. Though he does travel to a distant place, it's not clear that this is the underworld, and it doesn't include the steps which form other instances of this type of event. An interesting paper I read recently, and I include in the reading notes in the episode description, is that Priam's visit to the tent of Achilles at the end of the Iliad is actually more representative of a Katabasis than this event in the Odyssey. Have a read if you get the chance, it's very interesting. It can be argued that what actually takes place is that Odysseus performs a necromantic ritual in which shades of the dead are pulled towards him through a pit he digs and makes offerings into. This pit also allows him to see other events, but as mentioned, there isn't much of a sense of him descending anywhere, certainly not into the Greek underworld. A counter to this is that the Greek underworld was a concept which evolved over time. For example, there's no reference in Homer or Hesiod to Charon, a benchmark of the Greek afterlife experience. A ritual in which the dead are consulted was nothing new by the time of Homer. Indeed, there are shared consistencies between what Odysseus does and a much earlier poem. Tablet 12 of the Epic of Gilgamesh contains a scene in which Gilgamesh speaks with the dead through a crack in the earth. Away from the thematic, the specifics of the ritual which Odysseus performs compares quite closely with those practiced by the Hittites. These were a people of what is central modern-day Turkey who rose to prominence around the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. It was a pit ritual in which you could have conversations or prophecies of various types, and therefore it could have been a cultural practice which dated from around the time of the mythical date of the Trojan War and was therefore retained within the poem. If so, it's a great example of something I spoke about at the beginning of the episode, where I spoke about anachronisms, but also cultural practices which would have been contemporary for its setting, and perhaps this is one such thing, something which actually would have occurred around the time again of the mythical date of the Trojan War and therefore the Odyssey. The subject of liminal places involving the dead offers me a neat segue into the revenge of Odysseus. Following the massacre of the suitors, their spirits are led by Hermes to the underworld, squeaking like bats as they depart, something I always find quite amusing. I'm not sure if I should, but, well, it just does what it does. The suitors have always been a fascinating part of the Odyssey. It's a fantastic narrative technique because what you have is two challenges in tandem. You have the sort of day-to-day things that Odysseus has to meet, and in the background you have the clock ticking, which is represented by those suitors. What I want to do is finish up by talking about the suitors and play a game of advocating for them. To begin with, I should be clear that I'm not saying they were innocent. The poem clearly paints them as guilty of not respecting Xenia. This was a core Greek belief. It was reciprocal behaviour as both guest and host and protected by Zeus, so it was pretty important. Throughout the poem, this is commented on. A good host who observes Xenia is the type who welcomes a stranger, such as Telemachus greeting Athena when she arrives in disguise. Likewise, a good guest is respectful and shows the correct level of deference to the host. This might involve gifts exchanged, though this is often restricted to the elites. The suitors don't act anything close to this. They really don't observe Xenia. They scheme and show no respect to either Telemachus or Penelope. However, their actions might be mitigated slightly with justification as to their frustrations. The chief component of their frustration is stasis. With Odysseus gone, the political system on Ithaca has stalled. The expectation is that this will be amended through Penelope remarrying. However, she's been able to stall the suitors for 3 years through her ruse involving the loom. Though the audience of the poem know Odysseus is alive, the expectation is very different in Ithaca. One of the suitors, Eurymachus, makes a comment that none of them have been able to marry while this has all been going on. And okay, they could go home and potentially miss out, but it does bring into view the wider issues at play here, that this wasn't just something affecting Ithaca, this was affecting the sort of political and social scenes elsewhere nearby. There are 108 of them, and yet only 12 are from Ithaca. So this is causing issues on a wider scale, and though you don't have to condone their behaviour, you can still understand their frustrations. We know what follows next, and following this, the massacre, there is uproar. Though Book 24 is hotly debated as being a later edition, it does show Odysseus in an unflattering light. One of the fathers of the now dead suitors, Eupeithes, confronts Odysseus with some home truths. The first is that he took men to Troy from Ithaca, and none have returned. And this is actually foreshadowed by a comment Circe made to Odysseus when advising him to follow her instructions to the letter. She warns him that returning alone to Ithaca will be a humiliation for him. His arrival at Ithaca with no crew isn't entirely his fault, but Odysseus isn't exactly the responsible captain, and his fingerprints are on a couple of bad decisions which do cost the lives of his crew. Take the incident involving Polyphemus, the Cyclops. It was Odysseus who decided to go and investigate the island of the Cyclops when this wasn't needed. And the reason for this? Odysseus wanted to see if he would receive some gifts. This decision is actually called out by a member of his crew as costing the lives of men and made quite vociferously against Odysseus when he arrives at the island of Circe and wants to get his men motivated to go and investigate. It's a rare, direct criticism of him. Added to this is his decision to arm himself against Scylla, something Circe states will delay their sailing past the monster and lead to more men lost. I mentioned that earlier, and that's exactly what happens. Where the actions of the crew lead to mishaps such as the bag of Aeolus and the cattle of Helios, the ever-sharp and cunning Odysseus is missing. He's unusually lackadaisical in allowing those situations to manifest, and you might even argue that the crew are quite happy to go against his orders. Why might that be? Eupeithes also adds to the list of the men that Odysseus has killed to those that have been lost. Did all of those suitors deserve it? Well, when one of them, a priest named Leodes, grabs the knee of Odysseus in an act of supplication, even stating that he never did anything wrong, Odysseus beheads him. Yeah, it is the heat of battle, or butchery, but Odysseus does let a bard go free shortly after this. The behaviour of the suitors isn't entirely out of kilter, though. It's more about them being unchecked. To understand this, we need to consider the nature of young men in Homer, and often they're presented as brash and unthinking. In short, they're hotheads, and we can only presume that many of the suitors were of this demographic. And we can see those types of behaviours elsewhere in Homer. You might remember the Phaeacian king whose sons goad Odysseus, and in the Iliad there's the funeral games for Patroclus, in which a young Antilochus is dangerously headstrong in the chariot race and realises his folly when he's being roundly admonished by Menelaus. Though there isn't an excuse to balance out the actions of the younger suitors, there is a sense of this behaviour as a given. And what makes it worse is that there's no check to it. With Odysseus gone, the young men are allowed to behave badly, because that's what young men often do. However, there is a counter to that in the poem, where Halitherses blames the parents. That said, it's not easy to know how much the parents could have done, especially given some of these suitors were from overseas. With all that said, the suitors are deemed to deserve their fate. It's made obvious several times in the early parts of the poem, and the poem is so good because it manages to balance out that tension. You sort of know what's going to happen, but even so, you still get a sense of tension being built around it. However, I think you can mitigate their behaviour slightly and point the finger at Odysseus a bit more, and I wonder if those things were debated in ancient Greece. One final point, and apologies for jumping all over the place, is about Laertes, and specifically the recognition scene where Odysseus seems to prank his dad. It can be seen as unnecessary cruel. However, there may be other ways to view it. One is that it underlines how dangerous the situation Odysseus is in. Though the suitors have been dispatched, there isn't an automatic conclusion to it all. As I've mentioned, the fallout following his actions towards the suitors has caused internal strife at Ithaca. In a sense, this supports one argument I've read, which Laertes is actually a symbol of a council of elders He's more a symbolic figure than an individual. He represents a particular demographic which Odysseus needs to get on his side, despite already taking a number of actions. The idea of a council or group of nobles wielding some form of political power wouldn't have been unheard of in the period when the poem was composed. Perhaps Laertes was that, his father, but also representative of that group of individuals, again, which Odysseus, in quite a vulnerable situation now, giving his actions against the suitors, needs on his side. And on that tangent, I come to the end of the episode. Of all the episodes I've done, this feels the most freeform, and I hope you've enjoyed me jumping from observation to observation. Let me know what you think about the suitors. Was Odysseus a bit too harsh on them, or was it completely justifiable? Or is there something between the two where you can kind of mitigate their behaviour, but still, yep, that's what's going to happen to you if you muck around in someone else's house too much? Let me know what you think, as I said. More importantly, until next time, keep safe and stay well.